Shalom and welcome to Nazarene Israel. My name is Norman Willis, and this is our midrash for Parashat Vayeira, and he appeared. We're going to talk about who appeared, and we're going to also talk about why we believe Yeshua came as a manifestation of Yahweh Elohim. So before we get there, we're going to talk about that in the Torah portion. But before we get there, we have two stops to make. One is a long stop in the barley, and then we're going to make a short stop. There's a praise report, a wonderful praise report came in. So we want to spend some time on our question of the week because this is the barley season, and about this time every year there's going to be a barley question. So let's just go ahead and deal with that issue here. Now, I am going to have to invoke the fair use clause because we are going to have to discuss some teachings that are out there that we're going to have to disagree with, and we're going to show why. Now, the question, I'm paraphrasing the discussion, is effectively, aren't we all supposed to bring a wave sheaf of first fruits with us up for the Pesach or unleavened bread? And you hear different variations of this. You hear some people say, doesn't every family need to bring a sheaf of first fruits, meaning every family's got to have their own little barley patch? Or is it every barley farmer has to bring the sheaf of first fruits when they come up for Pesach? Or there's a few different variations. And so then the logical question becomes, well, if that's the case, then doesn't that mean you have to have ripe barley in the land of Israel before you can declare the month of the Aviv, or at least know that you will have it in time, that everyone will have Aviv barley in time for the feast? And the answer to that is yes and no. And so what you have here is what's called conflation. So what we have is two very important issues that are separate. They're being conflated. So they're being considered to be one single issue. So what we have is there's an issue of a singular wave sheaf for the nation, which is symbolic of Yeshua. And then you also have your family first fruits offerings. Whatever you grow, whatever your increase, you're going to bring a first fruits of that increase when you come up for the feasts. So we're going to see also some timing issues. But what we're going to see is, if you've ever seen two different people and they're looking at the same thing, but they're reaching different conclusions. So again, we're going to invoke the fair use clause. We have to discuss these things in order to answer people's questions, in order to let people know what's going on. This is from the website. Thank you for the links. This is from Devorah's date tree. Everyone brings their first fruits at the feasts. So we believe that this is where people are getting this information from. So we might as well just go ahead and discuss the article. Again, we are invoking the fair use clause. We want to speak the truth in love. The truth isn't always pleasant, but we can try to speak it in love. So Devorah's date tree in the article, everyone brings their first fruits at the feasts. So this is a quote. So to remind you, Hag HaMatzot, which is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is one of three national harvest festivals. That's true, where the farmers are required to bring the first fruits of their produce to the priest. That's true. When they go up to the temple for the feast. Okay, so we got, just to point out, we got some mixture going here. So first we're talking about three national harvest festivals. And anyone who's growing anything, when you've harvested something, then the next time you go, you take what harvested from the last feast. You were there for Pesach. So what you harvest then in between then and Shavuot, then you take that up for Shavuot, and then whatever you harvest over the summer, then you take that up for Sukkot, and that's how you go. So So what we see here is that things are going to get conflated because we go from three national harvest festivals, and then now it says when they go up to the temple for the feast. So we believe that's probably, we don't have time to open all those links here, but we believe that's probably a reference to Pesach and unleavened bread. But no, we've taken three and we're funneling it into one. So 3 in 1 feast, I suppose. So continuing on Hag HaMatzot, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, okay, Pesach on unleavened bread, the farmers bring an omer of their crop to the priest, and they quote Leviticus 23:10, as a reshit or a first fruits offering. We'll keep reading. It's understood that all the farmers must bring this offering at the feast, as the passage starts off saying, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them," and then the entire passage is written in the second person plural. Okay, so let's just read that real quick. Well, and ends with, "It shall be a perpetual statute in all of your dwellings." Okay, so that doesn't make sense to us. I mean, we can understand what she is saying, but it would take too long to explain, and she's reaching, we believe. I hope to say that respectfully, but these things are not proven. So the questions that we would remind everyone of is it that everyone brings their own personal family sheaf, or every farmer brings a sheaf for his farm, or is it that you need one sheaf for the nation, and then everyone who's a farmer of any kind brings the first fruits that come in over up to the next feast? So I think these things are being conflated. It would be my best guess. Okay, and we're going to see more evidence of that as we go along here. So, but first, let's take a look. Vayikra, or Leviticus, chapter 23, starting in verse 10, says, "Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I give to you," and then she said it's the first person plural, which is correct. So give to you all. So when you come into the land which I give y'all and reap its harvest, then all of you, all y'all shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest, meaning a sheaf for the nation. Okay. He shall wave, because he's talking to y'all. All of y'all are supposed to bring a sheaf for the nation. So he shall wave the sheaf, not the sheaves, not your sheaf and your sheaf and your sheaf. He shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted on y'all's behalf, all y'all's behalf. On the day after the Shabbat, the priest shall wave it. So we can dive into the Hebrew if people want. And then verse 14 gets also quoted. It says, "You shall eat neither bread nor parched grain nor fresh grain until the same day that you have brought an offering to your Elohim. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings." Okay, so she mentions that it's a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. We're not exactly sure where she's going with that, but she quoted it, so there that is. Let's come back to what she was saying. So she says, "And it ends with, and it shall be a perpetual statute in all of your dwellings, in all y'all's dwellings. And we also know that no one is to appear at the feasts empty-handed." That's also correct. Okay, but again, we're conflating the two issues. We're conflating the singular wave sheaf for the nation with family first fruits, or farm fruits. So we'll continue to show this. So here she continues, "As the beginning of the biblical year is when the barley fields are ready to feed the nation," or in other words, her interpretation is that you declare the beginning of the biblical year when you have enough barley to feed the nation. Okay, that's her interpretation. And we're going to take a look in just a moment at Joshua 5, verses 10 and 11. And so, but that's what she's looking for. She's looking for enough barley to feed the nation. That's when she will declare her biblical year. And then we'll talk about why that doesn't work. So, and then she says, "Everyone must bring an omer of their produce on Hag HaMatzot." Okay, now we're not quite sure what that means. So we understand whatever is harvested in between Sukkot and Pesach, you're going to bring that up with you when you come up for the Pesach and Hag HaMatzot. We get that. But everyone must bring an omer of their produce. So does everyone need to have barley? Does everyone need to grow an omer of barley? Does everyone, what exactly is being said here? This sounds like an interpretation rather than fact. It's that what it looks like, a big interpretation with a bunch of cherry-picked verses just stuck in there to justify it. But we're going to look at Joshua 5, verses 10 and 11. Now, here's the thing. Here's the big problem here. She says the fields may need to start being harvested prior to Yom Hanafat HaOmer, or the day of the wave sheaf offering, wave sheaf day, which to us, that just does not compute. And we're going to see why. It's because they don't pay attention to Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9. They ignore it completely. And we're going to see it in just a minute. But what she's saying here to us logically does not compute. She's saying you may need to start harvesting your fields. You may need to start cutting your crops before Yom Hanafat HaOmer, which is the wave sheaf day, which is the day you're supposed to cut your crops. That's when your crop cutting begins, because that's when you start the Omer count. Okay, so it tells very specifically in Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9, that's when you do it. So I want to let's just leave it there and move forward. We're going to come back to that. Okay, let's take a look at Joshua 5 verses 10 and 11. People need to be very, very careful with their analysis and not make assumptions, not make leaps that don't have solid foundations under them. So it says, verse 10, now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Pesach on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho. Good, perfect, very good, praise Yah. Verse 11, and they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Pesach, unleavened bread and parched grain on the very same day. There's only one way that can happen, and that is for Pesach to fall on Shabbat. Okay, so we'll take a look here. So this actually happened 4 years ago. We had Pesach fell on a Shabbat. We already had this chart handy. This is from a previous discussion we shared with the Karaites. They didn't respond to it. But so what you had is you have Pesach taking place on the Shabbat, and then, but you haven't had the wave sheaf offering, so you're eating of the old crop. Okay, well then on the first day of the week following the Pesach, now you can begin eating of the new crop because you've given the wave sheaf offering. So therefore it says, and they ate of the produce of the land on the day after the Pesach, which was the day of the wave sheaf offering, because Pesach was on Shabbat, unleavened bread and parched grain on the very same day. So praise Yah, very good. But the problem we get into here is that the Karaites and many Messianics also assume that because this was the situation in Joshua 5, this must be the situation. You have to have the situation to where, let me see if we can find it. You must have that situation in order to declare the year, because that's what they think Aviv means, is you have enough barley in the land of Israel to feed the nation. Okay, well, we're going to see problems with this hypothesis. So coming back to her article, she says, as the beginning of the biblical, as the year begins, when the barley fields are ready to feed the nation, and she's quoting Joshua 5, but that's, it's like the problem with this argument is that in Joshua 5, verses 10 and 11, it just so happened that the barley fields were ready at that time of year, but it's not absolutely that the barley fields are going to be ready at that time of year. There's several assumptions being made here. Well, let's keep driving forward. We'll talk more about the assumptions. It says, everyone must bring an omer of their produce on Hag HaMatzot. Once again, is it every family? Is it every farmer that grows barley? What are we talking about? But the thing that just throws us, the fields may need to start being harvested prior to Yom Hanafat HaOmer, or the wave sheaf day. Now, to us, that just does not compute. That's a clear violation of Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So it says, the fields may need to start being harvested prior to the day that you're supposed to start harvesting the fields, which is Yom Hanafat HaOmer, the day of the wave sheaf offering, because that's when it says you start the count up to Pentecost, up to Shavuot, when you start to cut, and you start to cut on Yom Hanafat HaOmer. So this to us is the reddest of flags right here. She's saying you can start to cut before you're allowed to cut. That's what's being said right here. So here we have Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9. It says, you shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. We just read that very plainly for what it says. Okay, begin your count of the 7 weeks up to Shavuot or Pentecost from the time you begin to cut the grain. Okay, when you start to cut the grain, that's when you start to count 7 weeks. Start counting 7 weeks when you begin to put the sickle to the grain. Okay, start your count when you start to cut. Start cutting when you start your count. It's very plain. Okay, that's the day you cut, and that's the day you start counting. Okay, and there's significance of this in the Hebrew wedding model also. Verse 10, then that's when you shall keep the feast of weeks to Yahweh, of Shavuot. So Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9 is very plain, very clear, but we don't see how it is addressed. We don't see, to us, it just seems like it just gets completely violated. Now here she says, this is why there's no prohibition against harvesting as needed. It's like, what version? Like, what are you reading? The same Devarim 16 and verse 9 I am? We can go to the Hebrew, I don't care. So you shall count 7 weeks for yourself. Begin to count the 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the grain. To me, that's very clear. That's when you start to cut, is the day that you start to count. But she says instead, there's no prohibition against harvesting as needed. In other words, if your barley is ripe, just cut it and lay it to one side. She says we're only prohibited from eating the harvest before Yom Hanafat HaOmer. That's not what it says. That is not what Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9 says. So Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9 says, begin to count when you begin to cut. Begin to cut when you begin to count. It doesn't make exceptions. So we don't, well, and if you press her on the issue, she'll use the Talmud as a support. Okay, so what she says, continuing, in other words, the farmers would harvest their fields as they became Aviv and put an omer aside. In other words, she's saying that you would ignore Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9, and every farmer would just harvest when their barley came Aviv. So every farm, and either they don't start counting, or you have every farmer has their own individual count. So how many different omer counts do you have, and when do you perform Shavuot? We don't understand. To us, what it seems like is that there's a conflation between the omer for the nation and the family first fruits. That's what it seems like, is those two things are being mixed together. if that's helpful. Okay, so the quotation was Devarim, or Deuteronomy 26, verses 1 and 2, verse 2. It shall be when you come into the land which Yahweh your Elohim is giving you as an inheritance, and you possess in it and dwell in it, that you shall take some of the first of all of the produce of the ground. Okay, so it's not specific just to the barley. Certainly it does apply to the barley, but it's not, this applies to any kind of crop that is grown, which you shall bring from your land that Yahweh your Elohim is giving to you, and put it in a basket, and go to the place where Yahweh your Elohim chooses to make his name abide. And there the priesthood will have a collection and reception point so that it can be properly collected and properly distributed, so that the whole of the priesthood is able to sustain itself by the people's tithes, gifts, and offerings. But she says, in other words, the farmers would harvest their fields as they became Aviv, okay, independent of Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9, independent of the day of the wave sheaf offering, and just lay an omer aside to bring with them when they went up to the temple for Hag HaMatzot. So that's her interpretation. And again, we believe there's a lot of conflation going on there. Because again, you're supposed to begin the cut when you begin the count. And you're supposed to begin to count when you start to cut. It doesn't, it's one count up to Shavuot, because elsewise you're going to have, how many different Shavuots are you going to host? It doesn't make sense. Okay, so she continues, in order for everyone to be able to bring an omer of their produce on Hag HaMatzot, again, the question about who and barley or all produce, but in order for everyone to be able to bring an omer of their produce on Hag HaMatzot, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and for Hag HaSukkot, or the Feast of Booths, to still fall out or line up with the end of the agricultural year, and she gives her citations for that, which we don't agree with her conclusion. We're not going to go into them here. But she says, if that's what you want, if you want everyone to be able to bring an omer of their produce in Hag HaMatzot, and you also want the Feast of Booths to line up with the end of the agricultural year, then the biblical year must begin with the crescent new moon after the spring equinox, which is the same as the equinox. It's when the day and the night are of equal length and the night of the day are of equal length. It's the same concept. She cites Genesis 1 and verse 14. There's no equinox anywhere in Scripture. There's a word tekufa that's sometimes used for the term equinox, but it doesn't correlate to an equinox. It corresponds to a cycle of time. It's a different concept. So, but again, so fair use clause. So Devorah's Date Tree also published this. Thank you for the screenshots. So when does the biblical year begin? So, and she answers the post right there in the header. It begins with the crescent new moon after the spring equinox. Okay, so the barley really doesn't even come into the picture at all. It's not really about the barley. It's about the sun, the moon. It's about the sun and the moon. It's not about the barley. It's about the sun and the moon. So just so people are aware, and everyone gets to make their own choices, a word to the wise is sufficient, or should be sufficient. And she continues, she says, although we don't look to the barley to try and determine the beginning of the biblical year. So she just comes right out and says it. Okay, the barley is not a factor in when we declare the head of the year. Just the sun and the stars. We do think it's nice to witness the barley fields ripening as we get closer to Chodesh HaAviv, or the month of the Aviv, and Hag HaMatzot, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, especially for those that aren't here. So you don't need barley. Okay, why do you need to observe the month of the Aviv? It doesn't have to be the month of the Aviv. It has to be the month of the equilux, the month of the equinox. Okay, the barley's got nothing to do with it no mo. Well, the first study we did on this is called the equinox error. I believe you can find it on the Nazarene Israel website. I'm not sure if it's in Torah calendar or if it's in the Nazarene Scripture Studies series, but just type in equinox error. It should come right up. We also have some videos and transcripts on the website. Where is the equinox commanded? Nowhere. Where is spring commanded? It's almost the same question. There's some different subtle shades of nuances, but it's the same question. So what she's telling us is that you need the equilux. You don't need barley, you need the equilux, and that's how you'll know you'll have barley, but it's not about the barley, it's about the equilux. Okay, so praise Yahweh for showing me where this chart was. This is a chart that we made back 4 years ago, back in 2021. We had a similar situation to this year, so we're just going to use this chart over again. We're 1 day difference this year, but we'll see the range, we'll see the spectrum. So here we had an early month, late month scenario, an A month, B month. So February the 13th was the day of the new moon sighting, the day of the Chodesh, was as Shabbat came to a close, if I recall. And then so 14 days later, you have Pesach in Jerusalem. Well, so you leave for Jerusalem, you go up to Jerusalem, and then you come have your Pesach on Shabbat, just like it was in the in the conquest of the land, Joshua 5, 10, and 11. And then here you have on the first day of the week, you'd have the wave sheaf offering. And so now you can harvest. Except the only problem is now everyone is in Jerusalem for the week. There isn't time to go home. If you live close, sure. But if you live any kind of a distance, you really don't have time to go home, harvest everything, dry everything, thresh everything. There isn't time. And you're supposed to be in Jerusalem enjoying the feast. Why would you spend it in transit going back to thresh and cut? It doesn't make sense. So then after the feast, of course, you can go home then and you can harvest then. And that's what is supposed to happen, is there's supposed to be a presentation of a singular wave sheaf, the very first wave sheaf, symbolic of Yeshua, on the first day of the week, the day of the wave sheaf offering. And then after that, everyone can go harvest their barley, because that's the day that the cutting begins. And you know when Shavuot is going to be. So, but here what we have, according to the Karaite model, notice that they have, well, here they wouldn't approve anything prior to the equilux in any case. But here, according to their model, what they're saying is you may have to start cutting before the day of the wave sheaf offering. So when you saw the Chodesh on February the 13th, 2021, you would have had to just, again, cut right away, get it all dry, even though that depends on the weather. You then do what you're going to do with it, or sell it if you're going to sell it because it's too far to carry it. You're going to have to do all that week, and then you're going to have to travel the next week and get into Jerusalem and be there and ready and situated with your sacrifice at the Pesach. All that takes time. All that takes doing. But basically, you have to cut before the day of the wave sheaf offering, according to the Karaite model. That's what she's saying. Okay, just ignore Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9. She doesn't mention it. It doesn't exist in there, or at least I haven't seen it addressed in that study. And that's how they treat it. Okay, now let's take a look at the B month. Okay, so here you had the Chodesh was seen on the close of the first day of the week. So now you have Pesach on the first day of the week, okay, but you still can't harvest, okay, because you have to wait until the day of the wave sheaf offering, which is on the 7th of unleavened bread in this scenario. Now you can harvest. So now everyone goes home, harvests their barley, and then brings up the first fruit offerings when they come back for Shavuot. But the way that the Karaites have it, you have, again, you have to break Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9, because you have to start cutting the instant that the new moon is seen. So if you're at any kind of a distance, that's not going to work. I mean, even if you're right there, as it was in Jericho, if the barley is right there, still now you're harvesting during the feast. Is that what you're supposed to be doing? Are you supposed to be harvesting, or are you supposed to be feasting? Scripture doesn't mention that. So again, people are free to make their own decisions. This is from Wikipedia. It's just a standard bell curve distribution. They talk about a single standard deviation, 2 standard deviations being 95% of the population and data, and then 3 standard deviations being 99.7% of the subject sample, and this kind of a thing. The problem is you can't get that much. You can't get a full 2 standard deviations if you're doing things the Karaite way. And this is something I will just tell you plainly. This is something I have tried to communicate to the Karaite calendar teachers at many points in time, but they don't respond to these. So this is something I have tried to communicate before. Don't know what else to say. So this is the same kind of a thing. Whether you get 1 standard deviation, 1.5, 1.6, 1.7, 2 standard deviations, you're still going to have quite a bit that's going to get cut off. Okay, well, the Karaites are going to say, no, that's not going to get cut off, because you just ignore Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9. Or they're going to say it doesn't apply in this case. So the people just harvest, they start cutting before the day of cutting. They start the harvest before the day of the wave sheaf offering. Okay, so here's, this graphic is something I'm not sure if I sketched it and Oscar cleaned everything up and improved it, or I'm not sure, but we were just trying to help people visualize what it is that we're talking about. So this is not a picture of a mountain in Israel. It's not a picture of an island rising above the ocean floor. What this is a picture of the passage of time, month by month, around the time of the barley harvest. So now, whether you choose to go from left to right or right to left, it illustrates certain things, and some things change, but there's other things that are still the same. Now, if we go from left to right, okay, so you have a dashed line at the new moon, so you don't have any Aviv barley, so you don't declare the new moon. All right, well, now the following month, you come to the first red line, and you see that there's a significant amount of Aviv barley, and that amount is increasing, and you take a look at the fields, and the fields will soon be ready. More of the fields will be ready. That would be a prime time to declare the month of the Aviv, because then you would have 2 weeks until the Pesach. But again, they're going to do that depending upon the equilux or the equinox. Now, we've seen years where you have the harvest of barley very early. I've seen this been before the equilux. We've seen other years that it's late, it's after the equilux. So in our experience, the equilux is not a factor. That's something that's being added to the text. But again, let's focus on this graphic here. So you coming left to right, you come to the first red line, and it looks like, wow, in 2 weeks, yeah, there's going to be plenty of barley fields that are going to be ripe and ready for harvest. So yes, this is the month of the Aviv. So some would declare it here, and others would say, no, you have to wait until everyone has their barley ripe. So you don't declare it at the first red line. Now that's declare it at the second red line. And then now you're going to say, well, now look, most of the people, in excess of 90% of the people, have their barley. And then say, well, what about the other 10%? Well, now you have to wait another month. Okay, if that's how you're going to play it, if that's how you're going to approach this thing, if all of the barley farmers need to be able to bring, I believe it was an omer of the harvest, you're going to have to wait you're going to have to wait 2 additional months. Okay, and if you don't do that, then what do the farmers do that their barley isn't quite ripe yet? Okay, and they have to break Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9 because barley only stays in the head for a very short period of time. It's ripe for a matter of days or a week at the most when it's properly sickle ready. So if you don't declare it at the right time, the barley all falls. Or according to the Karaite model, you ignore Deuteronomy 16:9 and just go ahead and cut it and lay it aside because they're not going to declare the feast until after the equinox anyway. Okay, so we don't find support in Scripture for these things. And we really don't understand why it's so difficult to understand that you're talking about a distribution here. You're going to have a tail. Okay, so what we're talking about is you offer the very first viable wave sheaf, symbolic of Yeshua, and that clears the way for the rest of the harvest. So now, as the farmers' fields are ready, they can harvest their fields. But you don't lose anything, and you don't have to break Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9. But if you go this other way, what they're really doing is they're trying to get, like the lion's share, so to speak. They're trying to get the biggest chunk that they can. But as you can see, you're going to have a head and a tail something is going to be wrong. Either you got to break Deuteronomy, or you're going to lose the tail, or whatever you're going to do. So I couldn't help but recall the same feeling. It's like, you try and explain this thing. These are things we have sent emails. We have tried to communicate this. These are posted studies. Again, we talked about all this 4 years ago. I can understand that not everyone has time to watch everything on the internet, but we tried to communicate by email. And why people can't understand that you can't break Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9 and say that you're obeying Torah. We don't understand that. Okay, now this image, I want to choose my words carefully. Now, this is a copyrighted image, Devor Gordon, 2021, all rights reserved. So this is from her 4th barley field inspection from the 5th of April, 2021. And I'm paraphrasing, but this is a total paraphrase. But that year, what was happening was that the Karaites were having a hard time establishing when was the Aviv. There were all sorts of different reports. And from Devor's date tree came the report, this is a total paraphrase, but effectively, we know that this has to be the month of the Aviv because we already have barley shattered and on the ground. We already have large sections of barley that are already shattered and on the ground. Therefore, by default, this must be the month of the Aviv. This must be the month when there's enough barley in the country to feed a nation. And then some of the barley, of course, in the higher elevations, in the mountains of Samaria, perhaps sides of Mount Hermon, Golan Heights, don't know, but someone might try growing barley in a cooler region. Again, that's going to harvest much later. So even waiting until you have whole fields of shattered barley, that doesn't mean the whole nation is going to be able to bring barley all at the same time, because barley in Israel, there's a lot of microclimates in Israel. Barley in Israel ripens over a 2 to 3 month span. So there's not going to be one tennis-like sweet spot where you pick this month or that month and everyone's covered, because you're going to pick the lion's share, so to speak, but you're going to continue to have those in the higher elevations with cooler weather that are not going to have barley ready. It doesn't work like that. So anyway, in Josephus, the Talmud, and the Omer, we talked, well, I can't remember the details, but basically the Karaites say that the reason they believe that they're doing right is this is the way it's recorded as having been done in the Talmud. So, okay, an argument from history, I suppose, but so that's a legal precedent, but is it the same thing as Yahweh commands? Is it the same thing Yahweh says to do? or is breaking Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9, in fact, not what Yahweh says to do, because Yahweh says not to break Deuteronomy 16 and verse 9. So we have a whole video covering it from a different angle. Let's not break Deuteronomy or Devarim 16 and verse 9. And Deuteronomy 16 verse 9 is put there precisely as a safeguard to stop people from doing what they're doing and to make sure that people take the very first sheaf of the first fruits, which is what the scriptures speak of. Another study, first fruits or false fruits. So the very first of the first fruits, the true first fruits, symbolic of Yeshua, is one thing. And then to let the true first fruits fall to the ground and be shattered fields of barley, and then you're going to harvest something else and produce that as your first fruits. Your first fruits are already on the ground. The details are in this study. And praise Yahweh, we also have a wonderful letter of praise and thanksgiving. And she didn't ask for prayer, but I'm going to ask for prayer. So we were so blessed by this sister's note. I guess this was a note attached to what looked like a tithe or a very serious offering. She says, the very best teaching that I have ever been able to find. Praise Yahweh, sister. She says, I'm so grateful for your faithfulness, and we are grateful for Yahweh's faithfulness and your faithfulness. And we're grateful that you're taking his word seriously. It's so refreshing to us to see someone taking his word seriously. She says, I've been looking for a lot of these answers for a long time. I started leaving the church teachings just before 2000. It's taken me such a long time to get the answers that you teach. Praise. I seem to be in such an amazing agreement with what I have learned so far, and I have ordered many books. I have been in a messianic congregation now, but question many of their teachings. Praise, that's wise. It would be so wonderful to find a congregation that taught like Apostle Norman. Thank you and shalom. And I didn't see a prayer request there, but I can kind of sense what should be a prayer request there. And so I would like to ask a prayer request here. And brothers and sisters, please pray with me that Yahweh is going to raise up his servants who will servant lead his people in these end times. And I guess I wonder if people understand the seriousness of what it is that we are doing. Yeshua has called us to the bridal tryouts, so to speak. And not only do we have to show up, we have to perform if we want to be chosen. And there's a lot of people who believe that because they're called, they're already chosen. And we need to be very straight with ourselves. We need to be strict with ourselves so that he doesn't need to be strict with us. So we need to be clear with ourselves and not delude ourselves. Are we really giving him what he wants, or are we not giving him what he wants? But you say, well, why does he want it? Well, we're told, we don't have time to unpack the whole thing here again, but in all of our studies, in all of our teachings, and in the Revelation studies especially, we talk about how we are entering into these end times and how the millennial government is going to be us. Those of us who take Yeshua's word seriously and organize the way he says to organize and do the things he says to do. Those of us who enter into covenant relationship with him by keeping and obeying his instructions will be his bride. And his bride or his body will rule and reign in his stead during the millennium. That's like it says in Daniel chapter 7, starting in verse 26. And we're talking about the heavenly court shall be seated. So we're talking about the divine council theology, the heavenly court with Yahweh at its head, and with the other created Elohim that did not fall, the good watchers. And they shall take away his dominion to consume and destroy it forever. We're talking about the little horn. So we're talking about effectively Esau. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints or the set apart ones of the Most High. His kingdom, meaning Yeshua's kingdom, is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Now, notice in the first part of 27, he's talking about the saints of the Most High. That's Yeshua's body, his hands and his feet. And then he says it's his kingdom, his people, his body, his hands and his feet are his kingdom. Well, what is a kingdom? But it's a set of ordered relationships that exist in relationship to each other. So because his body orders and organizes itself the way Yeshua says to do, all dominions shall serve and obey him, because all dominions shall serve and obey his body during the millennium. Is that a simple job? Does that take no order, no organization, no discipline? Let's be real. Let's not kid ourselves. Come to Yeshayahu or Isaiah chapter 9 and verse 7, it tells us of the increase of Mashiach Nagid's government, of the increase of the millennial reign and of the peace, there will be no end. Upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice from that time forward, even forever. So this is part of the fallout that takes place after trumpet 7. And he says, the zeal of Yahweh of hosts will perform this. Okay, well, do we have this zeal? Brother, do we have the zeal of Yahweh of hosts? If not, how do we plan? What do we plan to do in the day of judgment? And if so, are we doing the things that Yahweh is doing? If we have Yeshua's spirit, are we doing the things Yeshua is doing? Okay, so these are the kinds of questions we need to be asking ourselves. We need to be clear about. Are we doing things to help Yeshua get the kingdom his Father sent him to establish? And he gave us homework effectively while he's gone. Those of us who care about him, those of us who love him, we have an opportunity to build his kingdom here on earth and to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, his order, his ways. And then everything else will be added unto us. And for this faithful sister who sent in her tithe, I guess I ask everyone, please, to pray with me that Yahweh will raise up these servant leaders. We can't just lay hands on you from out of nowhere. We have to know you. We're in an unnatural situation. We're coming out of the messianic mess. We're trying to reestablish order and organization within the house of Joseph in the hand of Ephraim. It's going to take some real dedication and some real discipline, some people who love Elohim. So please pray with us that Yahweh is going to raise up his workers in these end times for his end time harvest, because the harvest truly is enormous and the workers truly are few. So thank you, sister, for your prayers and for your support. Let's all keep praying that Yahweh will raise up his servants, not people who want an income stream, not people who want to be in charge, but people who want to serve. Okay, so now let's do some refresher about the fallen watchers before we can talk about this week's Torah portion and how Yeshua is a manifestation of Yahweh Elohim. Now, in Bereshit, or Genesis chapter 3 and verse 1, we see the first episode recorded of the fallen watchers. It says, now the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field which Yahweh Elohim had made. And he said to the woman, do you really need to do what Yahweh says? Can't you make up things on your own? Don't you have the ability to make up your own mind what to do? It won't cost you. You won't die. Well, we look up this word serpent, Strong's Hebrew 5172, and effectively it's a prognosticator or an enchanter or a diviner. Now, diviners typically can be related to heads of state. So, for example, we saw in Bereshit or Genesis 44 and verse 15, Yosef said to his brothers, "What deed is this that you have done? Did you not know that such a man as I, a second in charge, someone very close to being a head of state, he's a potentate of state, did you not know that I can certainly practice divination?" So, and this is how Egypt operated, was contact with the occult, contact with fallen watchers, contact with demons. So now we have in Genesis 6, we have fallen watcher episode number 2. It came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, when daughters were born to them, that the sons of Elohim, we're talking about Yahweh's sons, these are spiritual beings, saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful. They crossed over from the spiritual realm to the material realm, and they took wives for themselves of all those whom they chose. Well, just as a question, there's a lot of Orthodox Jews who don't have a problem with what we just talked about in terms of the fallen watchers, but they don't see how it could possibly have happened with Yeshua. Okay, so why would the fallen watchers, the sons of Yahweh, have a certain capability that they could use for evil, and Yahweh would not have such a capability that he would use for good? I mean, Yahweh can part the Reed Sea. He can make the sun stand still in the sky. He can make a woman from a man's rib or a man's side, but he can't make her pregnant. It's like his arm's too short. He can make the sun, the moon, the stars, and all that is, but he can't make her pregnant. Well, the record in Luke chapter 1, starting in verse 30, so then the messenger, this is, I'm not sure if it's a watcher, but it's a good messenger, said to her, "Do not be afraid, Miriam, for you have found favor with Elohim. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Yeshua. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and Yahweh Elohim will give him the throne of his father David. And he will reign over the house of Yaakov forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end." So Joseph has a big job to do in there in that verse. Verse 34, then Miriam said to the messenger, "How can this be, since I do not know a man?" I don't have a relation here in the material realm. 35, and the messenger answered and said to her, "The set-apart spirit will come upon you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore also that set-apart one who is to be born will be called the Son of Elohim." So here we have Elohim, Yahweh himself, how should we say, coming from the spiritual realm into the material realm. He's acting in the material realm. Okay, so well, if the fallen watchers can do that, the fallen watcher's father doesn't have the ability to do that? Let's be real. So people sometimes, again, we'll talk about this briefly because people have questions about this. So Matthew chapter 22 and verse 30, Yeshua is telling us that in the resurrection, we will not marry. Okay, we will not marry, we will not be given in marriage, but rather we will be like the messengers of Elohim in heaven. And then there's a lot of discussion. But what this means is that the messengers of Elohim, at least in the spiritual realm, and I'm not an expert on this, but they either don't have gender or they just simply don't marry and are not given in marriage. They're not supposed to do that. So the fallen watchers, of course, they broke that rule. They left their realm and they crossed over into the material realm. Okay, they were disobedient in that way. That's what the problem's all about. Okay, so now we have seen how the fallen watchers can leave the spiritual realm and manifest in the material realm. We've also seen how Yahweh Elohim can manifest in the material realm. So now let's take a look in the Torah portion and see how Elohim manifests in the Torah. So we come to Bereshit, or Genesis 18 and verse 1. It says, then Yahweh appeared. So Vayeira, then Yahweh appeared to Avraham by the terebinth trees of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. Okay, now if you want to know the full details, can recommend the study Yeshua, the Manifestation of Yahweh. We recently retitled it. It was a colon. Now it's Yeshua, the Manifestation. Or if you just type manifestation in the search bar, it'll probably come up. But we come to verse 2, and it says, so Avraham lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, there were 3 men who were standing by him. Okay, well, it says that Yahweh appeared, okay, but now all we see is 3 men. So when Avraham saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the ground. Obviously, he must have recognized something special about them. Verse 3, because he said, Adonai, which is a title for royalty, can be applied to Yahweh. Adonai, if I have now found favor in your sight, do not pass on by your servant, but let us do something for you. Let us cook for you. So Yahweh agrees in verse 6. Avraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal. Knead it and make cakes. And as we spoke last week, there's symbolism, or deep layers of symbolism in all of these things. So, for example, Ramban, in his commentary on Genesis 12 and verse 6, tells us that what the rabbis taught, whatever has happened to the patriarchs is a sign or a portent to the children. So what that means is we're not just reading about Abraham running into the tent. It's like, why are we reading all these details? Okay, well, there's significance to these things. There's symbolism. So in Matityahu, chapter 13 and verse 33, also as we saw last week, so Yeshua spoke a parable saying the kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal until it was all leavened. And so leaven is symbolic of sin, and women in Scripture are typically symbolic of spiritual entities. So in this case, the woman is Babylon, or Mystery Babylon. And what she's done is she has effectively denatured 3 groups of Abrahamic seed: Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So they're effectively held apart by Esav, the red horse in the center, who is effectively a modern manifestation, you could call a re-manifestation of Nimrod, because he fulfills basically the same functions and purposes. But during the millennium, Esav will become no more. So after trumpet 7, Esav will begin to disappear, and he will not be during the millennium. So then you will have the black horse, the green horse, and the pink horse will be cleaned up of his Esavite leaven. It will become the white horse once again, and you will have the 3 measures of meal brought back together. So verse 7, Avraham ran to the herd, took a tender and good calf, and gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. Now, the rabbis go some completely other direction with this. It says Avraham took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and let's notice that they ate. So that means Yahweh and the 2 other messengers that were with him, the 3 men, they all ate of butter, milk, and a calf. So they ate meat and milk together. That's Yahweh's example, the example of the 2 messengers that manifested with him. Okay, so that's Yahweh's example. Why is this such a problem in Orthodox Judaism? So for those who don't know, This is the Wikipedia article on just titled Milk and Meat in Jewish Law. So just read it right there. It says the mixture of meat and dairy. So it's basar b'halav. So in other words, meat in milk. It says it's forbidden according to Jewish law and not according to the written Torah, but according to Jewish law. This dietary law, basic to kashrut, is based on 2 verses in Exodus, and the third time it's repeated in Deuteronomy 14. So the 3 verses are Exodus 23 and verse 19, Exodus 34 and verse 26, and Devarim 14 and verse 21. And you're welcome to look those up. You can also look up the references to the Talmud on the Sefaria website. But let's take a look here at the first of these 3 verses. So Shemot, Exodus 23 and verse 19, it says, the first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of Yahweh your Elohim. Okay, we've been talking about bringing the first fruits of your land into the house of Yahweh, but he also says, you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Okay, so we understand this as a commandment not to perform a Canaanite pagan practice, that there would be many fertility rituals of this kind, and Yahweh's saying, this is one of the things I don't want you to do. This is one of the pagan practices I don't want you to pick up. That's how we understand it. Well, the rabbis go completely a different direction with this. So this is the Babylonian Talmud tractate Hulin 115b, or the backside of page 115, leaf 115. It says, the school of Rabbi Yishmael taught. The Torah states 3 times, you shall not cook a kid in its mother's milk. Okay, it says that in Exodus 23, it says that in Exodus 34, and it says it in Devarim 14. And then he says, one verse serves to teach the prohibition against eating meat cooked in milk. Okay, we don't read that in the written Torah, but somehow that's become Jewish law. Another verse serves to teach the prohibition against deriving benefit from meat cooked in milk. Again, we don't read that anywhere in the written Torah. That's something the rabbis have made up. Okay, and one serves to teach the prohibition against cooking meat in milk. Okay, so that's not how we understand this at all, and this interpretation is not proven. So, but it says the prohibition against deriving benefit from it. So, for example, an observant Orthodox Jew could not own a hamburger stand, even if he himself did not work there, because he would be deriving benefit from serving meat and milk together. So this is where the rabbis go with this kind of a thing. So you can see it's a perfect logic chain. It just ends up contradicting or adding to or taking away from the word of Yahweh, which is strictly prohibited. Same kind of thing happens with the barley in the calendar. People adding things that aren't actually there. So we come to verse 9. It says, then they said to him, where is Sarah, your wife? So he said, she's here in the tent. And he said, I will certainly return to you according to the time of life. And behold, Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening in the tent door, which was behind him. So let's drop down to verse 17. So it's been men, now it's Yahweh. So Yahweh said, shall I hide from Avraham what I'm doing? Since Avraham will surely become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth shall be blessed in him. Verse 19, for I have known him in order that he may command his children and his household after him, that they keep the way of Yahweh to do righteousness and justice, that Yahweh may bring to Avraham what he has spoken to him. So what this says to me is that Yahweh has a special gift he wants to bring us. He just wants to see who are the 10% who love him enough to do the things he says to do. We love him, but are we willing to do righteousness? That means keep his commandments. Yeshua says, if you love me, keep my commandments. He means all my commandments. He means enter into my program, enter into covenant relationship with me. Because that's what I want you to do, because that's how I want to bless you. Yahweh says he wants to bring this blessing to Avraham, meaning to us as his seed. So verse 20, Yahweh said, because the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and because their sin is so grave, he will go down and check and see what's going on. Now we're going to fast forward through some of these slides. What we need to see effectively is that things change from Yahweh and two messengers to three men to two men plus Yahweh. So we have spiritual beings here who can manifest in different ways. We get to verse 22. The two men turned away from there and went towards Sodom, but Avraham still stood before Yahweh. So we have two men plus Yahweh. Verse 33, we have Yahweh finishes speaking with Avraham. Come to chapter 19, verse 1. Now we have two messengers entering Sodom and meeting with Lot. But we drop down to verse 10, and the two messengers turn back to two men. So they're described as men, even though they perform a miracle, striking the other men who were in the doorway with blindness. Verse 12, the men say to Lot, do you have anyone else here? Because Yahweh has sent us to destroy this city, even though they're just men. Verse 15, they're back to being messengers. Verse 16, they're back to being men who take hold of everyone's hand, because Yahweh is being merciful to Lot and his family. So now we come to verse 23, and it tells us that the sun had risen upon the earth when Lot entered Zoar. Verse 24, then Yahweh rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from Yahweh out of the heavens. Okay, now, if you're Orthodox, how many Yahwehs in this passage? You see two Yahwehs there in verse 24? Okay, so we have Yahweh on earth, who rained brimstone and fire on Sodom and Gomorrah from Yahweh out of the heavens. So we understand this as Yahweh the Son, effectively Yeshua, being manifested, raining brimstone and fire from Yahweh the Father out of the heavens. That's how we understand this. And people protest and they say, how can you possibly have two Yahwehs? Well, take a look, hero. Here it is right here. Genesis 19 and verse 24. How do you explain it? Okay, well, people protest. They say, well, no, because you can't, because Devarim or Deuteronomy 6 and verse 4 tells us that Yahweh our Elohim is one. That's true. So they say, well, okay, if Yahweh is one, how can Yahweh be two? Say, well, how do you explain it? They say, well, how do you explain it? Okay, well, we like looking up words. So we look up this word echad. It's Strong's Concordance. It's Hebrew 259. Okay, it's from 258. It means united. Okay, it doesn't mean one and only one singular with no more. It can be united. It can be a plural one. Okay, it can also mean together. So Yahweh is one, Yahweh is united, Yahweh is together, and he is first. So in Yohanan or John chapter 10 and verse 30, Yeshua tells us, I and my Father are one. I and my Father are united. I and my Father are together. You can have Yahweh the Father and Yahweh the Son, and they can be united. They can be one. Okay, if you'd like to know more details, we have more information in our study, Yeshua, the Manifestation of Yahweh. You can just search for it there in the search bar. So in chapter 21, Yahweh visited Sarah as he had said and did for Sarah as he had spoken, because he's a faithful Elohim. So Sarah conceived and bore Avraham a son in his old age, and they called his name Yitzhak. Verse 8, so the child grew and was weaned, And Avraham made a great feast on the same day that Yitzhak was weaned. Okay, well, why would Avraham make a great feast on the day Yitzhak was weaned? If he's just no longer taking milk, why would that be such a great feast? Well, could it be that there's more to it than that? All right, well, let's take a look at other passages in Scripture where weaning exists. So we'd look at Shemuel Aleph, or 1 Samuel chapter 1, in verse 23. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, meaning Hannah, do what seems best to you, only wait until you have weaned Shemuel before leaving him with the priesthood. Only let Yahweh establish his word. It says, then the woman stayed and nursed her son until she had weaned him, and then Shemuel was given to the priesthood. And at that point, he was expected to be able to be an independent, effectively a young, responsible, mature adult. So that's the biblical significance of weaning. People wait for a bar mitzvah. They're waiting far too late. Okay, this kind of responsibility is supposed to take place at weaning. There's important internal changes that happen with weaning as well. For example, Tehillim, or Psalms 131 in verse 2 tells us, surely I have calmed and quieted my soul. Okay, so internal quieting that goes on. So you can hear Yahweh's voice. Like a weaned child with his mother. Like a weaned child is my soul within me. Okay, I'm calming, I'm quieting myself. I'm not paying attention to the lusts of my eyes, the lusts of my flesh, or my pride. I'm trying to quiet and calm all those things so I can hear Yahweh's voice, so I can obey and serve him. Well, if you'd like to know more about why weaning and not a bar mitzvah, we can recommend our study of the same name. It's in the Beit Mikra, or synagogue, but Beit Mikra Leader's Handbook. Okay, now we come to chapter 21 and verse 9, and let's say this very delicately. There's something important here that shouldn't get lost. So it says that Sarah saw Ishmael, the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Avraham, scoffing at Yitzhak because of the weaning. Okay, well, in context, Avraham is a very rich man. Avraham has been called a prince of Elohim. He has a 318-man trained army. He has a lot of wealth. Effectively, he's a minor king of sorts. So anytime you have a kingship, you have a succession. Even simply a patriarchal family that's run according to the Bible, you have a succession, so to speak. So Ishmael was older, but Yitzhak was the heir. So in those days, assassinations could and did occur. So it was very much a concern to see Ishmael, the son of Hagar, scoffing at Yitzhak. That's not the kind of respect that needs to be shown to a future heir. Therefore, Sarah said to Avraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, namely with Yitzhak. And the matter was very displeasing in Avraham's sight because of his son. But Elohim said, do not let it be displeasing. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, because in Yitzhak your seed shall be called. So in context, what this means is that Ishmael can and will, a remnant of Ishmael will come back into the covenant, but he has to come into the covenant through Mashiach Nagid, just like everyone else. Verse 13, he says, yet I will also make a nation of the son of the bondwoman, because he is your seed. Verse 14, very difficult moment. Avraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, put it on Hagar's shoulder. He gave it and the boy to Hagar and sent her away. She went to the wilderness of Beersheba. Her son, so verse 20, Elohim was with the lad, and he grew and dwelt in the wilderness and became an archer. Verse 21, he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran. His mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. If we had more time, we'd show the links between Egypt and Esau in Rome, but that's for another time. So verse 21 tells us that Ishmael dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, as we saw before. That's in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, in the area around Medina. But what does it mean? What's the significance? Okay, drop your Nachmanides marker there. What does it mean? Well, we saw last week in Parashat Lech Lecha in chapter 17 and verse 19 that Elohim said that Sarah, his wife, would bear a son and they would call his name Yitzhak. And Yahweh would establish his covenant with Yitzhak and with his descendants after him, both houses, Judah and Joseph. Okay, but let's notice some patterns here. Okay, so there's a pattern that shows up in scripture from time to time. So here we have the mother is barren. It's a special mother, a special matriarch, and Elohim promises a special son, and the covenant then, or some special service, then comes through him. Some kind of anointing, something special comes through that special son of the special matriarch. So we come to Luke chapter 1 and verse 31. We see something very similar. It says, "And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Yeshua. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High, and Yahweh Elohim will give him the throne of his father David." And notice here, similarly, the mother isn't barren exactly, but she's a virgin, so she shouldn't be with child naturally. But then Elohim promises a special son, and the covenant comes through him. So same kind of a pattern. Coming back to Genesis chapter 22 and verse 1. Now it came to pass that after these things that Elohim tested Avraham, and he said to him, "Avraham," and he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Take now your son, your only son Yitzhak, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you." Okay, so here, not only has he circumcised the foreskin of his flesh, but now it's threatening to cost him the fruit of his body and the fruit of Sarah's body. This is very similar in John chapter 3 and verse 16. It says that Elohim so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, his only unique son. He had other sons. Yahweh has other sons. He has the fallen watchers. He has other non-fallen watchers. But this is a special son. This is his begotten son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. So we see a pattern. We see a sacrifice of a unique son at Moriah. We also see that you have to act in faith in order to access the covenant and receive blessings under the covenant. Chapter 22 and verse 3, Avraham rose early in the morning. He saddled his donkey, and he took 2 of his young men with him, and Yitzhak his son, and he split the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which Elohim had told him. Now, it's interesting. We can note a couple of comment items. There's 2 young men, and there's also wood in this passage. Let's come to Yohanan or John chapter 19 and verse 17. It says that Yeshua, bearing his cross or his execution stake or gallows or whatever you want to call it, went out to a place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha, where they crucified him and 2 others with him, one on either side and Yeshua in the center. Okay, so can we see 2 other men and wood in this passage? Genesis 22 and verse 4 says, "On the 3rd day, Avraham lifted his eyes and saw the place afar off." Okay, so Luke 9 and verse 22, Yeshua said, "The Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised the third day. So can we see the third day motif? So now we come to Genesis chapter 22 and verse 5, and we see that Avraham must have had faith in a resurrection. And you say, well, how so? Well, Avraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey, and the lad and I are going to go yonder and worship. And Avraham knew he was supposed to offer up his son. And yet he says, and we will come back to you. Okay, well, how can he offer up his son and then yet both of them will come back? We come to Ephraim or Hebrews chapter 11, starting in verse 17. It tells us that by faith, Avraham, when he was tested, offered up Yitzhak. And he who had received the promises of physical multiplicity, every tribe, every nation, every tongue, he offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in this one, in Yitzhak, your seed shall be called. This is the one who got offered. Well, he must have concluded that Elohim was able to raise Yitzhak up, even from the dead, from which Avraham did receive Yitzhak back, at least in a figurative sense. And you say, well, why did he have faith in a resurrection? Well, as we saw last week in Parashat Lech Lecha, in Genesis chapter 17 and verse 19, Elohim had already promised to Avraham that Sarah, his wife, would bear a son, and they would call his name Yitzhak, and that Yahweh would establish his covenant with Yitzhak for an everlasting covenant and with his descendants after him. So Yitzhak did not have descendants at this point. Therefore, if he was to offer up Yitzhak, Yahweh would have to resurrect Yitzhak. And people say, where's the substitution sacrifice in that? So we come to chapter 22 and verse 6. Avraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Yitzhak his son. And he took the fire in his hand and the knife, and the two of them went together. So again, we've already seen the parallel in Yohanan or John chapter 19 and verse 17, that Yeshua also is bearing wood, and that there were two others with him when he was crucified. Verse 7, but Yitzhak spoke to Avraham his father and said, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, look, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Avraham said, my son Elohim will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. So the two of them went together. And people say, where is the concept of substitution sacrifice in the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac? Yohanan or John chapter 1 and verse 29, we see where Yohanan HaMatbil, or John the Baptist, saw Yeshua coming toward him and said, behold, the lamb, or the sacrifice offering of Elohim, who takes away the sin of the world. So Yeshua is the lamb. Genesis 22 and verse 9, they came to the place of which Elohim had told him, and Avraham built an altar there and placed the wood in order. And he bound Yitzhak his son and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Avraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. So notice that Yitzhak is arranged upon wood, just as Yeshua also will be arranged upon wood. And here we have Yitzhak's father, who loves Yitzhak, is preparing to offer his son as a sacrifice. Well, Yahweh did offer his son, Yeshua, as a sacrifice. That's why Yohanan Aleph, or 1 John chapter 4 and verse 10, tells us that Yahweh loves us and sent his son to be the propitiation, or the atoning sacrifice for our sins. Genesis 22 and verse 11, but the messenger of Yahweh called to Avraham from the heaven and said, Avraham, Avraham. So he said, here I am. So because he was faithful, he said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear Elohim. Not only were you willing to circumcise your flesh, but you're not even withholding the fruit of your body from me. You're not even withholding your only son from me. So again, what we see is that Yahweh stops Avraham from sacrificing his own human son, but he does continue with the sacrifice of his son, Yeshua. Verse 13, then Avraham lifted his eyes and looked, and there behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. So Avraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering instead of his son. And Avraham called the name of the place Yahweh will provide, or Yahweh Yireh, which means Yahweh will see to it. And people say, where's the substitution sacrifice in that? Well, Yeshayahu, or Isaiah 53 and verse 7 tells us that Yeshua was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He was led as a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. So Elohim did provide the lamb for the offering. So now we come to verse 15, and we start to see how Avraham's love of Yahweh manifests through listening and obedience. So the messenger of Yahweh called to Avraham a second time out of heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, says Yahweh. Okay, so the messenger of Yahweh is Yahweh. So is he Yahweh the Father, or is he Yahweh the Son? We would argue that he is Yahweh the Son, because you have Yahweh in the heavens, and then you have Yahweh who manifests on earth, calling down fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay, but back to verse 16. The messenger of Yahweh, which is Yahweh, says, by myself I have sworn, because you have done this thing, and you have listened for my voice, you've done what I said, even to the point, not only did you get physically circumcised, but you've not even withheld the fruit of your body. You've not withheld your only special son. So now that I know I can trust you, now that I know that you have my best interest at heart, now that I know that you want to help me establish a kingdom for my son, now that I know that you want to help establish the kingdom of heaven on earth through your obedience, blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your descendants shall possess the gate of their enemies. And in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. And if we also are sons and daughters of Abraham, then this is how we can know, is because we're listening for his voice in order to obey it, including everything that is written. So if we have love for Yahweh Elohim, let us manifest this love by hearing his voice and doing everything he says to do. If you can't hear his voice yet, then start with the written word. Do we love Yeshua? Are we doing everything Yeshua says to do? Brothers and sisters, please pray for Yahweh to raise up the servant leaders of his choice. Thank you. In Yeshua's name. Amen.